Welcome back to the third chapter of the book. Now, in the third chapter, we're going to look at the pre-Neolithic period. So we're going to go into the Mesolithic, the Paleolithic, basically what we would call, I guess, tribes people, cavemen, whatever you would call them. Now, in this period, we're going to do the same as we did with the Neolithic. We're going to look to see if we can find any state of nature or sovereign. Now, right off the bat, I don't think anybody's going to find it reasonable that we'd find a sovereign at this point. So we're going to just disregard that for now, and we'll look at the state of nature, which is what everybody would assume we'd find at this point. Now, basically, I'm going to say that there was no state of nature from the outset. Now, this is going to be a point of contention for modern people, modern political theorists, because again, they'll look at the New World, the tribes people in North America and South America, and say that they were in a state of nature and kind of are at the present, because you still have some tribes who don't live within any sort of modern order in places like the Amazon. Now, I'm going to state that they aren't living in a state of nature either, which is something we'll get to later. But in the first point, what we're going to do is look at these people anthropologically, and what modern anthropologists and even older ones have actually stipulated is going on with these people to try and figure out what's happening here. Now, the first thing we have is that in the Neolithic and the Classical period, we had all of these orders, as I mentioned in chapter 2, that were living in these ritual sacrificial orders. So these were orders which are centered around sacrificial act, where animals which were being kept in captivity were being sacrificed, and then the gods were being consulted for laws, and it was all focused around this process. Now, if we go back prior to this process kind of breaks down, because we don't really have much evidence of animal sacrifice going back to this period. But if you think about it logically, that's not entirely surprising, because these people living in hunter-gathering sort of state ways of living, they wouldn't have had animals captive. So the idea that it would be sacrificing captive animals is kind of a bit odd. Now, there have been lots of people have theorized that maybe there's some sort of link with hunting going on there. There's some sort of connection there. Now, I would probably agree with that to a point, but a better way to probably view this is that this sacrificial way of doing things, which you find in agricultural societies, is not really developed from one particular aspect of these tribal people, but they're actually from the overall logic of the whole way in which they're living. Because one of the problems which we have with Locke and Hobbes and all of the other people, all modern people as well, is that when they're looking at these tribes people and these so-called primitive people, they're kind of like imagining them as being them. So they're seeing them as being secular individuals just milling around, seeing the world as they see it. Now, the problem is these people are not doing that, and this is something which Salins has been exceptionally helpful with. These people, while person to person, biological person to person, are living in states which you could probably say are quite equal. Each biological person within the village or within the tribe is very, very equal, and there's little differentiation of rank. There's no one who breaks out and becomes the leader, particularly at any particular point. I mean, we do have that, but in general, they're seen as being generally equal. Now, where this all breaks down is if you extend the concept of personhood past the biological and physical. Now, in these tribes, in these primitive peoples, they worshipped gods and spirits and all of these different things around them, which Salins calls meta-persons. Now, if we grant these meta-persons ontological reality, concreteness, and imagine that they're actually real, so these gods are real, these spirits are real, they're actually real as the biological people, and then we look at these tribes and these different peoples in that sense, then the idea that they're living in a state of nature of equality collapses completely, because what they're doing is they're actually living in a really, really severe hierarchy in which all of the biological people are operating within a band together within this hierarchy. And these gods and different demigods, different spirits and all of that are very much kind of like their overlords or their superiors, and they have massive amounts of hierarchy themselves. These different spirits and different gods, they have their own hierarchies which are quite impressively complex. They're like states upon themselves. So at that point, the whole idea that they're living in a state of nature and a state of perfect equality is just complete. It's not realistic. They're not. But the only way, but if we reject that, what Silence calls the enchanted universe, these meta persons, and just look at the biological people, then we could be easily mistaken in looking at them as being living in a complete state of perfect equality. And that's what everybody has done. And that's a very bad way of looking at them. Because what these people are doing, or how they live, is that they have constantly in a state of communication and exchange with these meta persons, which for them exist concretely all around them. So, for example, if they'll go hunting, when they hunt, they have to hunt in a very specific way. They have to follow very specific rules so as not to anger the gods who owned the animals, who are in charge of the spirits in charge of that area, the forest, or what have you. Because if they hunted in the wrong way, they killed the animal in the wrong way, butchered it in the wrong way, they did something wrong, then it could bring misfortune back on them and their village and all of the people around them. So this constant state of communication going on with this other world, constantly, every single second of their life, everything. And it's kind of similar to the way we live now with the modern state. If we imagine the modern state as being a meta person, we're kind of in that situation now. We have to communicate with the modern state. We have to do what it says. We have to organize around it. It's a real thing for us. It's a concrete reality. But if you imagine aliens who came down and just looked at us without understanding this, they'd think we're incredibly strange and we're living in a state of perfect equality as is, because we kind of are in relation to the state. I mean, that's kind of what's happened with these meta persons and these tribal peoples. Now, if you look at archaeological evidence, which we do have for these people going back in time in the old world, and just putting aside the people in the new world for now, we do have archaeological record in things like burials or in cave art. And in these burials and cave art, these seem to support the idea that these people are living in this sort of situation. I mean, we have some of the oldest cave art, depicts people dressed as half human, half peoples, like shamans. Now, these shamans were basically people who were stepping in between these two different worlds. Now, the fact that we have this cave art from tens of thousands of years ago indicating this, immediately off the bat supports the premise that these people were not living in states of nature. They were living within these, I don't want to say religious infused worlds. The better thing would be Silence's enchanted universes. So they were living within quite complex hierarchies, but these hierarchies were governed by these meta people. Now, we also have, again, the burials, which kind of indicate this as well. We have these special people, and a lot of the time, the people being buried, they're being interpreted as being princes or kings, but they're people who have like special, I'm not going to say deformities, but they're special people. They have something special about them, like they're very big, or they've got some sort of birth defect, or something like that. Now, on the first blush, this might not make much sense, but if you think about these people as understanding these people with birth defects as being in some way not normal, as being special, as in some way apart from everybody else, and it gives them some sort of indication that maybe they're connected with this other world, then you could see them being understood as being someone that everybody turns to for maybe advice. I mean, you have this apparently in African tribes where people who have epilepsy will be looked towards as being like seers. I mean, that's kind of like something we saw in the Western world as well with epilepsy. And you also see in, to give an example, in the New World, it seems like maybe the I think it's the leopard cults, maybe with people with Down syndrome. So in many of these older places, in these primitive societies, people with special or special people with disabilities, were actually looked upon as being very special and possibly in communication with the other world. And we're also seeing this maybe, for example, in Neanderthals and other groups like that. So I believe in Spain they found a site where there's lots of antlers from deers, which are arranged in what looks like a very ritualistic order. So this seems to be a characteristic of humanity which goes back about as far as we can see. And this also seems to potentially be connected with other things such as body modification. For example, in many caves in France and Spain, they found handprints where the hands seem to be missing digits. Now, there's been a lot of argument about this as to whether these missing digits are due to frostbite or maybe fighting or something along those lines, because many archaeologists don't seem to be able to grasp the concept that maybe this is being done deliberately by these people, because it from the modern perspective, it doesn't make much sense. It's not utilitarian. If you're living in southern France or Spain during the Ice Age, chopping off a bunch of your fingers is not particularly helpful to selection because it makes your life a lot harder. But the thing is, we do have evidence of this, contemporary and historical, where people would sacrifice parts of their body for various reasons. I believe there's a tribe in, I think it's Papua New Guinea or Indonesia, that region, where they bite their fingers off as part of some sort of ritual process. I think it's in relation to bereavement. We also have examples in Native America where people chop off the fingers as gifts to the gods as part of some sort of quest. We also have many examples of this from Europe. We have many examples where parts of the body were sacrificed to the gods. We even have the example of circumcision, which is another example of that. And there's another example which, on first view, would seem like a very strange thing to bring up. But when you consider it in more depth, it does start to begin to make more sense. And that is the issue of human sacrifice and cannibalism, which these people definitely practice. I mean, cannibalism is something which was practiced quite extensively for a long time. And we have evidence of it going back to proto-humans as well. Again, we have evidence of Neanderthal cannibalism. We also have evidence of cannibalism in proto-humans dating back millions of years. Now, the normal assumption that's taken by modern people on this is that was probably due to diet. Like, for example, they were starving. Like for example, you have in the modern world, you'd see cannibalism in situations where, for example, in Chile, when the plane crashed and the survivors ate the bodies of those which hadn't survived. Now, the thing is, if you go back into other cultures which had been met by Western people during the period of exploration, like Native America, we find them practicing cannibalism very widely, North America and South America. Now, this is something which is hard to come by, because a lot of the evidence for this has basically been wiped from the internet because it's for political reasons. But if you have a political theory, it really does need to explain this. And if you go to North America, the North American native tribes were practicing this quite extensively. They were engaging in human sacrifice, and that's on record. They were doing it up until the 18th, 19th century. That's on record. It was practiced quite extensively in South America, as pretty much everybody would know by looking at history of the Aztecs, who were engaging in very bizarre sacrificial ceremonies. You also had it across the old world, in Europe, in Africa, in Central Asia, China, and also across Oceania, where some of the most striking examples of sacrifice and cannibalism were occurring. Now, you could see that as being a precursor to animal sacrifice, as being a replacement for animal sacrifice, which I think is perfectly reasonable. But the thing is, like, modern political theory just does not even try to explain any of this. It doesn't even bother. It just ignores it quite in a quite embarrassed way. But these are things which do need to be addressed and do need to be established by political theory. Now, what seems to be happening here with much of this cannibalism and much of this human sacrifice is, again, it's a process of communication with this enchanted universe. And this is something Silence points out as well, because if you give personhood to vegetation or trees or anything like that, and you're eating that vegetation as well, then it's quite a short step from that to cannibalism. It's very, very similar. I mean, it doesn't make much difference. But these are things which do need to be addressed by political theory. And again, modern political theory and liberalism is just completely hopeless with this. Are they living in a state of nature? Are they living under a sovereign? It doesn't account for it at all. It can't explain any of this. It's just completely at a loss as to what to say about it. So again, while we might not be able to see sacrifice in the same way that we see in Neolithic and later orders, we do see the general logic of it anyway. We see the process of communication, engagement, and interaction with these meta-persons. And we see it through all of these different processes, either through body sacrifice, human sacrifice, even potentially some sacrifice of hunted animals, which is one thing which probably did still happen, but it's hard to find in the archaeological record. I mean, I believe there's some examples of Native Americans capturing bear cubs to be sacrificed, which, again, is kind of there and thereabouts. But, again, what we don't see at this point is a state of nature. These people are not modern individuals completely devoid of any sort of organization, just milling around, beating each other on the head with sticks and bats. They were living in quite complex, sophisticated organizations. But the organizing process of this was this world of the meta-persons. But again, this is something which Locke and Hobbes and all of the modern people from the Enlightenment onwards, especially when they were looking at Native Americans, that's something which they were completely blind to. It's like being unable to see in infrared and being unable to see all of the aspects of something in infrared or ultraviolet, and only being able to see the color spectrum, which is what they were doing with these people. They could only see the color spectrum. They could only see the biological people. They weren't able to understand or factor in these meta people who these primitive people were considering as being real and concrete entities. I mean, to give another example of how this logically works out, imagine if you were walking along the street and you saw somebody randomly swinging their arms in the air, screaming about bees, attacking them, and then running away. But you could see nothing. You just saw the person screaming bees and then running away while flapping their arms. Now, for you, there's a couple of ways you could assess that. I mean, the first thing you probably think is they're crazy. There's something wrong with their mind. Now, that would be a perfectly valid way to assess that. You could then reconstitute what's happened there as being a result of some sort of brain injury or some sort of imbalance of chemicals in the brain causing them to act in that way. But you can't really explain their behavior very well by using that method. Because, I mean, if using that method, you could explain that because they've got some sort of brain injury, they're acting erratically. But that doesn't explain why they were waving their arms in that specific way or why they were shouting about bees. The only way you could really explain that would be to take the premise that they're seeing these bees real as just a placeholder, as just a standing at that point, and then assessing their behavior in relation to their really seeing these bees. In that case, you can explain why they were waving their hands, because they thought bees were all around them, and why they ran away, because they thought these bees were going to sting them. So if we give these bees the concrete reality at that point, then it does allow us to explain the behavior of that person at that point. And while, again, the other explanation that they're just crazy is perfectly valid, it doesn't offer the same level of explanation as giving the bees the concrete reality. I mean, this is not to say I'm saying the primitive people are crazy and they're hallucinating. I mean, that's a completely different argument you're making entirely. What I'm saying is that for these primitive people, we really do need to give these meta people concrete reality when we're considering how they're organizing their orders. And this is especially important when we're trying to establish if they were living in a state of nature or not. Because the state of nature, as put forward by Hobbes and Locke and more modern people like Rawls, does require them to be as if they were modern humans who are completely secularized. And this is something that Marx also does with his idea of primitive communism, which is something we'll come to later. Because the problem with this is if you are taking away these meta people in this other world and refusing to accept it, then you are really mutilating what's actually happening here, because you're then trying to explain how these people are connecting and organizing only with relation to the biological people, and trying to reconstitute what's happening only from these biological people. And it doesn't give you a means to explain what's happening at all. I mean, it gives you some kind of explanation, which is what modern political theory has been limping along with, but it doesn't give you a really good explanation of why they were doing X or Y or Z. It really just doesn't. And the subject of the next chapter is going to be this problem of what is basically what I've said before was retrojection. These people like Locke and Hobbes and Marx and everybody else has taken their understanding of the individual, their understanding of people, and their rejection of this meta-person existence, the meta-person aspect of these people's existence, and then just projected that onto these people and then tried to reconstitute what they were doing based upon that. So this state of nature seems to be based upon a giant process of retrojection. So that's something we're going to go into in the next chapter.